One of the most disappointing realities of modern American life is how a nation founded on skepticism of power, distrust of concentrated authority, and a sober view of human nature has produced generations of students increasingly sympathetic to systems that require precisely those things. The answer is not mysterious. It is not so much about youthful rebellion or economic anxiety as about what is taught, what is omitted, and, perhaps most importantly, what assumptions are quietly embedded in the educational system itself. America's founders did not create their institutions on the premise that people are wise, benevolent, or selfless. They built them on the assumption that people are fallible, self-interested, and capable of great harm when power is unchecked. That understanding was not cynicism, it was realism forged by history. Yet modern education increasingly treats this foundational realism as either irrelevant or morally suspect, replacing it with abstract visions of fairness divorced from incentives, trade-offs, and historical evidence. The result is predictable. Students emerge with a moral vocabulary, but without an economic one, with passionate opinions, but little understanding of how societies actually function. The founders understood something that is now rarely emphasized in classrooms. The central political problem is not how to empower the good, but how to restrain the bad. James Madison warned that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Government exists because people are not angels, and therefore government itself must be constrained for the same reason. Yet contemporary civics education often presents government not as a necessary danger to be limited, but as a benevolent problem solver waiting only for the right intentions. Power is discussed as if it were morally neutral, rather than something that attracts the ambitious, the self-interested, and sometimes the unscrupulous. This omission alone goes far in explaining why socialism appears attractive to students who have never been required to confront the question, who wields this power and at what cost? Economics, when it is taught at all, is frequently stripped of its most important lesson, that intentions do not determine outcomes. Prices are treated as arbitrary, profits as suspicious, and inequality as evidence of injustice rather than as a complex result of countless individual decisions, skills, risks, and preferences. Students are taught to ask who deserves what, but not how resources come into existence in the first place. Capitalism, in this framework, is reduced to caricature, a system of greed rather than a mechanism for coordinating dispersed knowledge. The extraordinary fact that millions of strangers cooperate daily without central direction to produce food, shelter, medicine, and technology is seldom explored. Instead, markets are portrayed as chaotic forces requiring correction, while centralized plans are imagined as rational, humane, and efficient. Despite overwhelming historical evidence to the contrary, socialism benefits enormously from this asymmetry. Its promises are judged by intentions. Capitalism is judged by imperfections. Failures under socialism are attributed to poor execution, bad leaders, or insufficient commitment, while failures under capitalism are treated as inherent and moral in nature. This double standard would not survive even a modest exposure to history. But history, too, is increasingly selective. Students learn about slavery, segregation, and injustice, which they should. What they often do not learn is how rare and fragile liberty has been in human history, or how unprecedented the rise in living standards has been under market economies. The narrative becomes one of oppression, relieved only by government intervention, rather than one of gradual progress driven by institutions that limit power and reward productivity. The founders' emphasis on property rights is frequently dismissed as self-serving or outdated, rather than understood as a protection for the powerless. Property is not merely about wealth, it is about independence. A person who owns something, land, a business, or skills that others value, has leverage against authority. A person who owns nothing and depends on political favor does not. Socialism, whatever its rhetoric, concentrates ownership and decision-making. That concentration inevitably means that those who control the system control people's lives. Yet this reality is obscured when economic power is portrayed as uniquely dangerous, while political power is treated as inherently virtuous. Students are rarely asked why abuses of power should suddenly disappear when markets are replaced by bureaucracies. Another failure of education is the neglect of trade-offs. Every policy has costs. Every benefit excludes alternatives. Yet students are often encouraged to think in terms of solutions without sacrifices, fairness without scarcity, and rights without responsibilities. Socialism thrives in such an environment because it promises moral clarity without complexity. Capitalism, by contrast, makes uncomfortable demands. It requires accepting inequality arising from choice and circumstance. It requires tolerating outcomes we might not personally approve of. It requires acknowledging that no one is smart enough to run an entire economy from the top down. These are not emotionally satisfying lessons, but they are true ones. The educational system's growing hostility toward capitalism is therefore not accidental. It reflects a broader shift away from empirical reasoning toward moral signaling. It is easier to condemn markets than to understand them, easier to blame systems than to examine incentives, and easier to teach outrage than restraint. None of this is to suggest that capitalism is perfect or that America has lived up fully to its founding ideals. The founders themselves would have been the first to acknowledge human failure. But they would also have insisted that systems be judged by results, not aspirations, and that power be treated with suspicion regardless of who claims to wield it for good. When students are denied this intellectual inheritance, this hard-earned wisdom about human nature, incentives, and limits, they are left vulnerable to visions that sound compassionate but ignore reality. Socialism fills that void not because it has answered history's challenges, but because those challenges have been removed from the curriculum. A society that forgets why it chose liberty will eventually choose something else. And when it does, the consequences will not be distributed equally. They never are.